Hi, everyone. I'm here to give you some of my own tips on giving an artist talk. And as you can see, I have a different background today that is filled with work from one of my projects. So it's just something you might consider when you're giving your own artist talk if you use Zoom, exactly like what I'm doing for you today, giving this presentation. So give me a minute and I'll share my screen. All right. So here I am, ready to give you a talk on giving an artist talk. So I'm just going to give you some tips today directly from some talks that I personally have given. So, we can get boring when we're talking about art. So what you want to do is do everything you can to make your presentation be exciting and interesting and make people want to know more about you. So here's the basics. It really breaks down to what you would do if you were telling a story, right? So an introduction, you want to introduce yourself, your name, and how you identify as an artist, what you do and how you do it. Introduce broad overarching themes or concepts. So you're going to just give an umbrella idea of what your work is about. And there's lots of ways to do that. We'll talk about that in a minute. And you can use an element of surprise or quotations to help you introduce your work. And sometimes the words escape you and you don't want to get too wordy. And I've found for my own self that if I do something kind of quirky at the beginning, or if I use a quotation, it really helps break the ice and it gives me a vehicle to introduce the work that I'm going to talk about. So the body of your presentation, of course, has to do with exploring samples of your work. They should all reflect back to how you've introduced the work. They should support that overarching theme that you talked about when you introduced yourself. Reference other work that explains or puts your work into context. You could use historical references or you could use artist references, and you'll get some information or some examples of that in just a minute. Use your own imagery for cues as you're talking. It's a lot to remember, a whole presentation. But once you do it a few times, you'll start to see that next slide come up, and it's really kind of like a security blanket because you know exactly what you're going to say. And never forget that you are the expert about your own work. So you can talk about it. You can also show process or in progress work, and I'll give you some examples of how that might happen as well. Your whole presentation for this assignment could be a process on one piece because you're only going to have 6 minutes. So anyway, that's what you could do for your presentation. When you conclude, you want to just kind of wrap up what you've said. If there's a quote or some final words or an image that kind of sums everything up, that's a great way to conclude. But always conclude in a way that leaves you open and encourages the audience to ask questions. So here we go. Let's look at some examples here. So these are all actual slides from presentations that I've done, so hence the way that they're presented to you here. So an element of surprise to introduce yourself. This is me and my ventriloquist dummy, Rusty, that I did when I was 11 and 12 years old. And so the idea for me in this was that I have a long history of manipulating inanimate objects, meaning that I'm a maker. And so this was my way of talking about it and introducing myself. Another thing I've used is a lot of my work is very political. And this is kind of tongue in cheek here, this political introduction here, but it's also a warning. It really is a warning that you might see at the beginning of a film, but I've manipulated it to talk about the fact that what they're going to see in that presentation is expressing my own personal political ideology, and it could be offensive to some viewers. So radically right or left individuals require accompanying adult guardians. So if you look at the film warning label, I've taken a lot of my rhetoric from that, but it's a fun way to start out, but it's also a way to give people a warning that this is what's going to happen. And often I also use quotations or quotes from books or things that I've read, other artists, that kind of sum up what I'm going to be talking about. So this is a quote from Barbara Kingsolver from the Poisonwood Bible. And if any of you've read that, you kind of know what it's about. But it really, this quote for me sums up my own personal experience as a woman, as an American woman that was born in kind of the baby boomer era, and how we were taught to kind of keep our mouths shut and wave the flag. So this is a really meaningful quote to me, and it helps me sum up the work that I'm going to show. And so this particular piece, we're talking about the body of your presentation now, but this particular piece really relates to that quote that I just showed. So if I were to start showing work, you want that work to start supporting how you've introduced yourself, how you've defined those overarching themes in your work. And this piece certainly supports the work that quote that I just showed. Another way to start introducing your work or putting your work into context is to show historic or other artists as reference. So this particular slide talks about the idea of covering the unnoticed makes it noticeable. And so you'll see that my project, the Collective Cover Project, really uses that idea of Christo when he covered things, unimportant things, made them kind of more noticeable. And of course, the wrapping of mummies. So all of those, that historic reference and the other artist reference plays into some of the themes that this piece of work plays upon. So this is a Collective Cover Project. Just to give you a quick background, I would collect pieces off the street, I would number them, I would embroider a patch, and I would cover that actual piece with fabric. And then each piece had a QR code attached to it, and you could scan that and go online and see kind of the story of where that piece was found, headlines from the day. I really created an archive for each piece. So you'll see that I actually covered 60 pieces for that project. So again, you can see how the idea and the act of covering these kind of marginalized pieces that I just found on the roads, thrown away or discarded, goes back to the idea of covering and the idea of Christo covering unimportant things to make them more important. So that's part of what this project is about. Another way to show your work is maybe to explain a process or explain your thinking. So for this next piece, I just got really fascinated with the ideas of knots and tying the different knots and the design of knots and what their use was for. So here's my thematic reference for that. And so what I did was I had a whole exhibition with knots, but what I used for the rope in those knots was cut up Trump t-shirts, Trump campaign t-shirts, because the title of that show was not N-O-T, but the pieces in that show were actual knots, K-N-O-T. So here's some of the process of cutting up that t-shirt. And here's the final pieces. So basically I took the function of a real life knot and I kind of twisted the words a little bit and made it fit into a political message about not regarding the Trump administration. All right, so in the conclusion, you could use an image. I often use this image to sum up if I'm talking about the violet protests, which, as you can see in my background, that's what I'm talking about here. But this image is the US, like we think of the United States, but it's also us. And that's what this project was all about. So I find that this particular image is a great way to sum up that particular presentation when I'm talking about the violet protest. And another way I've summed up presentations is because I use textile processes quite a bit, and I use them for political protest or activism. I use this quote from Alice Stone Blackwell, who was the leader of the women's suffrage movement. And so there was a whole article that I talk about, but this quote alone really summed up my talk. So let us keep knitting and crocheting for the Bazaar Sisters. So that really sums up the work that I do and kind of why I do it. But if you've seen the whole presentation, it all makes a lot of sense. So just some tips to remember when you're thinking about an artist talk. You are the expert. I find that if I have too many notes, I forget what I already know. So share your story, share your motivations. It's interesting to people. And don't be afraid to share those intimate things about what motivated you to make a certain piece. Think of one or two takeaways that you want people to remember. So that your talk kind of revolves around those themes. And for me, it's always the idea of political activism or using these soft techniques to convey some hard messages. Forget art speak. Be clear, be concise, and make your words and your delivery accessible to a wide range of audience members. You're more approachable that way. You're more likable that way, rather than being too esoteric and too kind of up on your pedestal sounding. I always look for references and metaphors to help me explain my work. Again, like the quotes or the mummy or Christo's work, all of those things kind of played into that particular piece. The knots and making a political statement using knots. So those are things that you can use in your talk to kind of explain what you mean by your work or the themes that you use. Before you do your talk, practice, practice, practice. Use the mirror. Say it out loud. I know I'm always embarrassed to do it, but here I am right now talking to you alone, and you can hear my dogs in the background. They're the ones listening to me. But at least I'm practicing, and you get a sense of your cadence, you get a sense of your timing, and you hone those points that you're trying to make and make them better and better. And if you practice it 3 or 4 times, believe me, by the end of that 4th time, you'll know exactly when you need to interject this thought or this idea. A logical sequence of your imagery helps you remember your talking points. So I said it earlier, but the reason that I use these presentations when I talk to you is that it cues me to talk about the things that I think are important. So no matter what I'm talking about, I use these slides to give me cues to what I want to say. So use your work as those cues for yourself. Always check your technology, figure out how you're doing it. If you're going to use Zoom for your artist talk, I've given you a whole step-by-step process on how to do it. So practice that, see how it works for you. And then, of course, in this context, this won't apply as much, but if you're face-to-face someday talking to a class or an audience, be prepared for questions. If your work is provocative, welcome those questions and discussion about them. It'll help you learn, and it'll help your audience learn more about you. So I am going to come back to you a little bit here. and just finish up this presentation. I hope that you take a look at this before you start thinking about your own artist talk and take some of the points that I've made. So I'll see you in class and see you later.